In his autobiography, Born to Rebel, the longtime president of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Benjamin Mays, described an episode during a trip that he took to India with the YMCA in 1937. He said the following: "While at Mysore, I was invited by the headmaster of an untouchable school in a neighboring village to speak to his students. I asked him why, since there were 13 U.S. delegates, why he had chosen me. He replied that he wanted a Negro, and when I told him that Channing Tobias was also a Negro, he answered that Tobias was too fair of complexion to do what he wanted done. I want you." I accepted his invitation, and on leaving Mysore, went to his school, where I dined with his untouchable students. After dinner, I was introduced as an untouchable who had achieved distinction. The headmaster told them that I had suffered at the hands of white men in the United States every indignity that they suffered from the various castes in India, and that I was proof that they too could be somebody worthwhile despite the stigma of being members of the depressed class. First, I was horrified, puzzled, angry to be called an untouchable. But my indignation was short-lived, as I realized as never before that I was truly an untouchable in my native land, especially in the southern United States. In my country, I was segregated almost everywhere I went, always in the South and often in the North. I was not permitted to sleep or eat in white hotels and restaurants, and was barred from worship in white churches. I had been slapped almost blind because I was black, and had been driven out of a Pullman car with pistols at my back. I, just as they, through the mere accident of birth, was indeed an untouchable. Now, there's an extended history of the comparison of the position of intensely marginalized communities in India with intensely marginalized communities in the United States, particularly a comparison that's been made for a sustained period of time between the status of Dalits in India and Black Americans. B.R. Ambedkar, the great Dalit leader and primary author of India's post-independence constitution, took a degree in economics at Columbia University in the United States and acquired firsthand knowledge of the similarities between the conditions of the two communities of denigrated peoples across opposite ends of the globe. Now, unlike the assertions of some Afrocentrists, the similarities that have been identified by Ambedkar and Mays were not anchored in mystical claims of a shared Afro-Dalit genetic link or genetic ancestry. Instead, the parallels drawn by Ambedkar and Mays concern the substance of paralleled lived experiences of untouchability. In my remarks today, I want to explore the persistence of Black untouchability in the United States. I want to examine the systematic, continued, and sustained economic underdevelopment of Black America. I want to start by focusing on the unemployment rate gap, which I view as one of the most significant indicators of the persistence of discrimination in the U.S. economy. It is indeed a paramount index of discrimination in America's labor markets. So the first thing I want to observe is that the unemployment rate for Black adults consistently is 2 times the rate of white adults. And we found this to be the case ever since unemployment rate statistics have been collected by race for more than 50 years. Secondly, this disparity of a double rate of unemployment for Blacks versus whites is maintained even after you adjust for educational attainment. So if you look at each notch of educational attainment, you will find that the 2-to-1 ratio is evident. So for example, among Blacks who have not completed high school, in 2012, the rate of unemployment was 20.4%. Among whites who had not completed high school, it was 11.4%. In 2012, for Blacks who had completed high school, the unemployment rate was 13.4%, but it was only 7.5% for whites. Among blacks with some college education or an associate's degree, the black unemployment rate was 10.2%, and the white unemployment rate 5.4%. And then among those who had completed college or received even more advanced degrees, the black unemployment rate was 6.3%, while the white unemployment rate was 3.7%. Now, you know, I haven't put these numbers up on a PowerPoint, so they may have gone by you fairly rapidly, but I want to highlight one set of comparisons in particular. That is the fact that might have slipped past you, that whites who have dropped out of high school have a lower unemployment rate than blacks who have completed some college. It's 11.4% for whites who had dropped out of high school and 11.6% for blacks who had completed some college education or an associate's degree. Okay. There are also staggering differences in unemployment exposure among young people. So the unemployment rate for 16 to 19-year-old blacks is in the vicinity of 45 to 50%, while for whites in the same age group, it's about 22 to 25%. And there is evidence that Andrew Sum at Northeastern University has amassed that demonstrates that 95% of teenage black men who did not finish high school are out of work. 95%. This is, of course, particularly significant since people refer to a school-to-prison pipeline, but the more accurate pipeline connection is a pipeline from unemployment to imprisonment, particularly for younger men. Joblessness is more closely associated with greater likelihoods or greater risk of being imprisoned than necessarily just being a school dropout. So if you drop out into unemployment, that is when your odds of imprisonment become much, much greater. Indeed, some found that 1/4 of all young black men, 16 to 24 years of age, who have dropped out of high school are in jail, prison, or a juvenile justice institution. Now, next I'd like to turn to some evidence from experimental research that demonstrates the depth of discriminatory conditions in American labor markets, or metaphorically, what constitutes the degree of untouchability that exists in American labor markets. So the Urban Institute in the late 1980s and early 1990s conducted a series of trained actor studies where they sent black and white pairs of actors out to seek jobs that were advertised and to see what kind of response the job applicants got. And systematically, the white job applicants were more likely to get callbacks and more information about other kinds of advancement opportunities within the organization to which they had applied for jobs. But there's also a more recent study that may be familiar to many of you, and it's referred to frequently as the NAMES study. So this is a study that was conducted by Marianne Bertrand and Sindil Muthathan, in which, in a couple of American cities, they sent letters to employers who had advertised positions in the classifieds in the local newspapers, inquiring about the opportunity to be interviewed for jobs. And these are false letters, but they're letters in which they use names that are either black sounding or white sounding. For example, the white applicant might be named Caitlin Harris or something like that, while the black applicant might be Lakeisha Washington. So they tried to gauge whether or not these letters evoked or elicited callbacks for interviews. And the callbacks for the white-sounding names were substantially higher than the callbacks for black-sounding names, although the submitted letters were letters that had CVs, curriculum vitae, that were comparable, or in some cases, slightly stronger for the black applicants, okay, or the black-sounding applicants. But maybe even the most damning study is probably a set of field experiments that were performed by a Princeton sociologist named Eva Pager. where Pager performed a set of experiments in Milwaukee and New York City. So these are both northern cities. Okay, so we can't have the explanation for what she found as some sort of hangover from southern animosity. Okay. So in her study, she runs a set of experiments where you have black and white males who are applying for jobs who are similar ages and have similar levels of educational attainment. But she found that the white males who reported that they had a criminal record in their application had a higher likelihood of being called back for a job than the black males who had no conviction reported in their applications. Okay. And let me go a little step further. I would want to argue that there's a lower payoff for stronger effort from blacks. There's a lower payoff from stronger effort from blacks. And most people who have invested a lot of time in making the claim that blacks on average have a high degree of oppositionality towards education, particularly native black Americans. Okay, so I don't want to impugn the recent immigrant black population in the same way, but there's a kind of standard argument that blacks are oppositional towards school achievement. The native black Americans, actually, young students, actually have this fear that they will be accused of acting white if they do well in school. The current president actually invoked this argument in 2004 when he first gave his first major speech to the Democratic National Convention, and that was the moment when I became very worried about what he was about. Okay, so but if you look at the data carefully and you control for the socioeconomic status of black families, you find that blacks get more years of schooling and more credentials than whites. So if you make an adjustment for the socioeconomic status or the family background of black students, you find that there's actually more educational attainment that comes forward from blacks. But the degree of discrimination apparently goes up with educational attainment. So this is somewhat subtle. I'm not making the argument that more highly educated blacks earn less than less highly educated blacks. Quite the contrary. They do, in fact, earn more. However, there's a bigger proportional gap between their earnings with whites with similar levels of education than less educated blacks and whites. So education promises higher incomes, but it also promises a greater intensity of exposure to discrimination. But now, I'm talking exclusively about the labor market. I don't think that the labor market is the most potent indicator of the degree of economic development within a community in the United States. Far more important indicator is wealth. So wealth rather than income. And there are huge gaps in wealth at all levels of income and educational attainment between blacks and whites in the United States. In fact, you find that the disparity in wealth actually gets higher the lower the income of comparably situated whites and blacks. And I mean comparably situated in terms of having the same approximate income status. But in 2009, which is probably the most recent comprehensive data we have providing us with estimates of wealth, the survey of income and program participation indicated that the median white household had a wealth position of about $113,000. The median Hispanic household had a wealth position of about $6,000. The median black household had a wealth position of less than $6,000. Okay? I mean, these are staggering disparities. They far exceed any disparities in income, any disparities that we associate or talk about with respect to the likelihood of getting employment. So essentially, the median black household had 1/20th of the wealth of the median white household. And I use the median because the median is uncontaminated by extremes in low or high wealth positions. Indeed, the median black household would need to save 100% of its income for 3 consecutive years to close the gap. Okay. Now, a lot of attention has been drawn to this notion that what we have to do to improve wealth disparities in the United States by race is to provide greater degrees of financial literacy to the black community. Well, this is silly. Okay. If you think about it, Bernie Madoff's victims generally were far from being financially illiterate. Okay. And individuals who lost substantial portions of their portfolio, perhaps many of us in the United States who were sitting in this room in 2008 with the crash of the U.S. stock market, I don't believe that the losses in wealth are attributable to being financially illiterate. Okay. Indeed, I would argue that financial literacy is hardly useful unless you have some finances to manage. So if we were to really seriously address the question of the racial wealth gap, we would have to devote our attention to having some sort of mechanisms for engaging in serious redistribution of wealth. One of those mechanisms might be a program of reparations, but if you're in the orbit of not thinking that we should do anything race-specific in the United States, well, Derek Hamilton and I have been talking about having a baby bonds proposal in which the federal government provides a trust fund or an endowment for each newborn infant, and the magnitude of that endowment or trust fund would be contingent on the wealth position of their family. So it would be graduated in some ways. I also want to argue that there's no significant evidence that black Americans on average are less financially literate than white Americans. Okay. There's no significant evidence. I mean, maybe everybody's highly illiterate, okay, but there's no significant differentials. So in fact, Wolf and Gittleman had a study in 2004 in the Journal of Human Resources that indicated that once you control socioeconomic status, the black savings rate is no different from the white savings rate. And indeed, in some income categories, the black savings rate is slightly higher. Moreover, once you control for socioeconomic status, returns on portfolios are essentially the same between blacks and whites in the United States. So, it doesn't appear that there's any significant behavioral differences around processes of seeking to accumulate wealth between blacks and whites. And so why do we have these huge disparities? Well, it's primarily because of the process of transfer of resources across generations. Okay? The Horatio Alger story has been labeled a myth, and it is exactly that. It is a myth. There are a handful of people who make great fortunes coming from nothing, but most people's wealth position is contingent on the fact that parents and grandparents have transferred substantial amounts of resources to them. And there are two types of these resources that can get transferred: inheritances and in vivo transfers. Inheritances are resources that get transferred across generations when the donor dies. But in vivo transfers are something we think about much less often. They don't have as dramatic imprint on us as inheritances do. But what are in vivo transfers? They are shifts of resources across generations that occur while the donor is still living. Okay? So for example, we could have a situation where parents or grandparents assist a son or a daughter or grandson or granddaughter with attending Duke University. And that type of financial assistance is an in vivo transfer. Suppose parents purchase a car for their child upon graduation. That's an in vivo transfer. If a young couple sets out to purchase a home and relatives provide them with the down payment for a mortgage, that's an in vivo transfer. So those kinds of transfers occur on a far lower scale within the black community because previous generations of blacks have less resources to transfer to the next generation, substantially less. Why is that the case? Well, we have to look at the history of the denial of black wealth accumulation. This begins with the failure of the U.S. government to provide the promised 40 acres and a mule in the aftermath of slavery. if that had been provided, it would have meant that the 4 million ex-slaves would have had approximately 40 million acres of land. What happens otherwise? Well, so 40 million acres of land is not delivered to the ex-slaves. By dint of their own efforts, however, by the beginning of the 20th century, they appear to have accumulated about 15 million acres of land in the South, which is considerably less than the 40 million that should have been delivered to them. But by the time we reached the 1980s or so, that 15 million acres of land had dwindled to about 1 million acres as a consequence of fraud, seizure, theft, and actual destruction of records of property ownership, which included the burnings of sections of courthouses where the documents lay that indicated that blacks owned property. And indeed, an argument has also been made. A significant part of the process of the lynching trail was associated with the acquisition and seizure of the land of the individuals who might have been lynched. So the key story that we have to look at is not within the period of slavery itself, but in the aftermath of slavery and the succeeding period of Jim Crow, where not only was there a failure to provide blacks with the promised 40 acres and a mule, but there was a process of continued seizure of the wealth that blacks had accumulated. And a final example of this process is associated with the communities in which blacks had achieved some degree of prosperity that were consistently razed, literally razed to the ground in the context of white terror activity. And there's a number of these communities, but the most significant examples are probably Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 and Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1923. So what I'm really interested in exploring with you is this process of continued economic underdevelopment of the black community, which I say is akin to the preservation of mechanisms of untouchability in American society. And the way in which we might go about addressing this means that we do have to confront head on the question of generating a racial redistribution of wealth.
Brother, what's up? This is a groovy party, man. I can dig it.